And that's why it's really my privilege today to moderate this panel in combating disinformation online and offline, because we see disinformation as an issue that pits two huge First Amendment values directly against each other: the freedom of speech, which protects our right to express ourselves even when that information is false, and the freedom of the press, which is supposed to ensure that the public is informed about the world around them. And that's directly undermined when it's hard to be able to tell what's true and what isn't, what's good information and what's bad. So our objective for our time on this panel today is to talk about what we've learned about disinformation since many people became aware in 2016 what a widespread problem it was. What we've learned, what are the best ways to combat it, what we need to learn about it, and what's next, what we should look to learning and implementing in the future. So that's a lot to cover, so thank God we have a very good panel with us today. I'd like to introduce, can you guys just come up when I call your name? Jameel Jaffer. He is the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, which promotes the freedom of speech and freedom of the press through litigation, research, and public education. I also have John Samples with me. John, are you here? Yes. John's a vice president at the Cato Institute. He founded and directs Cato's Center for Representative Government, which studies the First Amendment, government institutional failure, and public opinion. With me also is Kelly Bourne, and Kelly is a program officer for the Madison Initiative at the Hewlett Foundation. She oversees grant making in areas like campaigns and elections, media and journalism, and civic engagement. And last we have Laura Hazard Owen. She is a deputy editor of Harvard University's Nieman Lab, which is dedicated to helping journalism figure out how to shape its future in a digital age. She writes a weekly column called Real News about fake news, which highlights reporting projects and data about misinformation and news literacy. So thank you so much, all of you, for being with us today. And we will start our conversation, but I'd like to reserve time at the end for questions from the audience. So keep those in mind. And before we dive into how we're going to solve the problem of disinformation, which we're going to do right now, right here on this panel, I think it would help if we all know that we're talking about the same thing, because you hear a lot of terms that are thrown around in this area: misinformation, disinformation, fake news. Kelly, you've written about how we need common definitions for these things. Can you get us started with some?
Yeah, so I would say that most commonly we talk about misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. Misinformation is unintentionally spread inaccurate information. Disinformation is intentionally spread. And then propaganda tends to be the politically relevant subset of disinformation, typically, historically, spread by state actors, but increasingly spread by non-state actors as well. And I think it's a problem in particular, and Ethan touched on this in his opening remarks, about really needing more research in this space. And the challenge that we're encountering currently is when you ask things like how much disinformation is out there, or who is spreading it, or who's consuming it, all of the scholars are using different definitions of the problem. And so we're not at a place yet as a field where we can say, well, there was X amount of disinformation in 2016, and in 2018 we had Y amount, because people are comparing apples and oranges, and some people are talking about totally made up fake news, Pizzagate, the Pope endorsed Trump, and others are talking about, really inflammatory, biased information that might be micro-targeted to specifically inflame people, but it might be, partially accurate. And so until we end up with a common definition of the problem, no one can really have a clear conversation about what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess for our purposes here today, misinformation, you said, is unintentionally spread. Disinformation, that is a conscious act, and propaganda sort of falls into that, but by state actors. And I think it's you can kind of see our knowledge of this whole subject has been developing in the past couple years. Our definitions are getting more streamlined, and there's been, as you said, quite a bit of research. And Laura, you basically, I read your column every week. It's amazing. And it's one of the best ways that I keep abreast with what's happening in that world. This is kind of a broad question, but what do you think we've learned in the past couple of years about the nature of mis and disinformation, who's spreading it, how it spreads?
I think that one thing that we've learned is that it's a very broad question. I think that one thing that we've learned is it can be difficult to separate out the reasons why people spread this information. So is it because, are they doing it on purpose? Is it because they know that it's false and they're spreading it for some other reason? Is it to be funny? Is it to make a point? Is it, if you're, for example, the Russian government, to sow confusion? We don't know a lot about some of the psychological reasons that are involved for doing this, and it can make it difficult to predict which kinds of interventions are going to work. I think that one thing that we've learned is that even when social media platforms have good intentions about the way that there's ways that they're going to try to solve these problems, that those don't always go as intended, that interventions don't always have the effect that you think they will. There's just a lot that we don't know.
So we're learning more about like the gaps in our knowledge as well as the actual disinformation that's been spread.
Yes, and we're also sort of learning. I think one thing we are starting to see is the platforms grappling with the kinds of interventions that they can do that might actually work, and we're just at the sort of the edge of figuring out like how to solve this kind of thing.
And I mean, speaking of the platforms, I don't think we can talk about it without talking about what role they should be playing, what their ideal, what kind of responsibility they should take on when it comes to mis and disinformation. And Jameel, that's something that you've talked about. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we have been working on removing or at least mitigating some of the obstacles to the study of the platforms and the study of disinformation on the platform. So it's one thing to ask the platforms to cooperate with us in trying to understand disinformation, but it's another thing. It's important to recognize the ways in which the platforms actually affirmatively interfere with the study of phenomena like disinformation. And I'm thinking in particular of terms of service that restrict the digital tools that journalists can use and researchers can use to study things like disinformation or filter bubbles or other social pathology, other pathologies on the platforms. And there are obviously very many good reasons for Facebook's restriction on scraping the platform, for example, or their restriction on the use of fake accounts. But one effect of those restrictions is that journalists or researchers who want to do certain kinds of studies on the platforms can't do them. And I think that's a really big deal. I think that a lot of the research that most needs to be done right now is research that violates the terms of service. And so I think it's important to start thinking about what we could do to create more space for this kind of journalism and this kind of research. My institute, the Knight Institute, has proposed to Facebook that it adopt what we've called a safe harbor to allow journalists and researchers to do certain kinds of investigations that might otherwise violate the terms of service. And we have been in negotiations with Facebook over that proposal for the last few months. But I think it's important to recognize the role that the terms of service are playing in obstructing the kind of research that we're talking about today. And the obstruction is made even more significant because there's a federal statute, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, that makes it, at least in the Justice Department's view, a violation of that statute, which imposes criminal and civil penalties, to violate terms of service. So it's not only that journalists have to worry about Facebook coming after them if they conduct these kinds of investigations, they have to worry also about the possibility that the Justice Department will come after them. And so I think quite understandably, journalists and researchers who would otherwise think about doing the kinds of investigations that are necessary to understand disinformation hesitate to undertake those investigations.
Wow, so we have these gaps in our knowledge, but the companies themselves are not really helping us fill them in that sense.
That's right. I would say they are affirmatively standing in the way.
And we have seen that they, Twitter, Facebook, Google, they've all taken actions they've all tried to deal with the disinformation problem in their own ways. And we've seen them exercise their control over the content that appears on their platforms. And John, you've written about content moderation and how that shapes the global conversation. Can you tell us more about that?
I think the most important distinction here, I hope this is working, is between public and private. In the public system, your speech of any sort is governed by the First Amendment. In Facebook, it's not, or any kind of private forum. So Facebook can do a lot of things that the U.S. government can't, right? However, it's still true that I think one of the things, and maybe a different perspective on this, is in my writing that I'm working on now, I treat disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, and so on as versions of subsets of false speech. Now, in the public sphere, false speech, at least since 2013 or so, basically is not an exception to the First Amendment. It is protected. And I think there are good reasons for that. In part, I think the good reason is I've never met anyone in my 20 years here in Washington, conservatives, liberals, whatever, who didn't believe that what the other side thought was actually not just a disagreement or whatever, but frequently just false, a lie, and should not have the, and often people assume it doesn't have the protection of the First Amendment. So I think it's too easy an assumption to think we can, sort of figure out what these things are and then engineer them away, or that Mark Zuckerberg will do it for us. Because pretty quickly, he's going to run into the same sort of problems when you start hitting the edges and drawing these lines, and you start hitting false positives, really, or at least you start hitting things that people complain about. Because again, the underlying problem is everybody believes the other side is lying in a highly polarized environment, but maybe before that. The second thing I would say is culturally, I was listening to a thing coming in this morning. It was about the Enlightenment. It just suddenly struck me. It was a good coincidence. The speaker said, Kant said in the Enlightenment that you're supposed to use your own reason to make these judgments. You're not supposed to have some paternal authority do it. Don't believe in authority. And there's all this stuff, as Jameel knows, and everyone knows in these First Amendment decisions about this. The censor is the individual. Trump's elected. Now do we throw the Enlightenment out? Did we not believe all of that all along? Why is it that why does Mark Zuckerberg have to decide for us? Can't we use our own reason? Culturally, isn't that important?
So you think it's sort of an individual's, it's on the individual to decide what they believe and what they don't believe, and that it shouldn't be the platform or say...
The platform can do it. Mm-hmm. What I'm appealing to here that is something deeper than like 1950s decision or 1960s decision, the First Amendment, something that goes deep into 1789 or 1780. There's this cultural assumption. Now I think we should at least say, or Zuckerberg should say or something, we don't actually believe that because it has all these terrible conclusions. People actually can't do that. Now, that's not going to happen, but it does seem to be that's the underlying assumption.
I think what makes this moment in time kind of interesting is that it comes with this moment where trust in media is at an all-time low. And this question is just for all of you. Like, how do you think that interacts with the disinformation online? Do you think it's one of the causes of it? Is it a symptom of it? Is it because there's too much information coming at us?
I mean, if you look at it longitudinally, the declines in the trust in media started before the introduction of Facebook, so it's hard to draw a causal line there. And also, if you look at our trends in sort of political polarization, which is also often attributed to social media platforms, those began before the introduction of these platforms. So I think it's hard to make a causal link. I don't think it's as hard to make a link that there is some exacerbation of these problems. by social media. And I think it also varies, and I think Ethan touched on this point, so much depending on the geopolitical context that you're talking about, right? And how this is playing out in the US versus in Myanmar is extremely different, or even other Western democracies like Germany that has a state-mandated history of news literacy and 50 times the per capita public broadcasting budget of the US and a much lower social media penetration. That looks really different than what you're seeing in the US context.
50 times, really?
Apparently.
Well, actually, yeah, let's talk about that.
It's a little depressing.
We think about sometimes misinformation and disinformation in the American context, but obviously it's a global problem. What differences do you all see when you're looking at misinformation and disinformation in other countries?
I think that one of the differences right now is just in terms of the way that this is being spread in countries like Myanmar and India and Kenya. A lot of this is being spread on closed messaging apps like WhatsApp, where conversations are completely private, they're encrypted, there's arguably no real way to monitor them. And even when we're not talking about things like different levels of violence or riots, like murders happening over the spread of fake news, which is also something that's happening in these countries. It's interesting to think about the ways that this is happening in a completely closed environment where nobody can actually see it, and it makes it just much more difficult to monitor and think about. I would also, just to go back to what John said a little bit, I think that I think we can sort of go back and forth about what hasn't yellow journalism like always been with us? Like, isn't this a problem that's been with us forever? And I think that what we are seeing that is different now is that it seems as if research suggests that beginning around the year 2000 in the United States, there seems to be people disagreeing on what were previously accepted facts. So, like, why is this a time around the turn of the century in the U.S. when people suddenly start doubting whether vaccines are safe? Like, why is this the time when, even though violent crime rates are going down, people start to believe that they're going up? Like, why are we suddenly actually disagreeing with each other about what were previously facts that we could all share, that we could all believe? And I think that's a little bit different from deciding what you believe. We're all sort of no longer working from the set of common facts that we were previously.
I see the distinction as like the difference between deciding like, well, I believe that this means this, and a fact about the world, like is this true? Is the world flat or not? Okay, do you think that's because of the internet?
Well, it's a question. We don't really know why it's happening, and this is happening, as Kelly said before, Facebook is really even around. So what is it about, I don't know, the year 2000 roughly, where this starts happening, where trust starts going down?
Can I just add, so I have a kind of maybe idiosyncratic perspective on some of these issues because I was a national security litigator for 15 years at the ACLU before I started doing what I'm doing now. And when we talk about disinformation now, it sometimes seems to me kind of disconnected from the conversations we were having about disinformation without using that word in the years right after 9/11. So, to me, if collectively we're going to focus on the disinformation problem, the first piece of disinformation that comes to my mind is Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, right? Now, this didn't come from the Russians. It didn't come from somebody sitting on a couch in New Jersey. This was the president of the United States who said these things. And this, arguably had a much more significant effect on the course of American history and the course of world history than any of the, the episodes that we all now customarily think of when we talk about disinformation on social media. And so I guess I struggle to figure out whether we should be separating these things. Are these two different phenomena? Is one just about the functioning of the U.S. government, and the other is about a discrete phenomenon that we can call disinformation on social media, or are these actually related things? And I don't know the answer to that, but It's a question that I kind of struggle with. And relatedly, when we talk about trust in the media, I again go back to the years after 9/11 when the media got so many very significant things wrong, right? And it's not just Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. It's that the New York Times sat on the warrantless wiretapping story for a year, right? For 10 years, all the major papers allowed U.S. government officials to go around saying that Section 702 is about targeting foreigners, right? And CDT knows better than anyone else that that's not true. And so when I think about the decline of trust in the media, it does trouble me, but at the same time, it troubled me in the years after 9/11 that we were so trusting. And so I'm trying to sort out in my own mind, to what extent when we talk about disinformation and a lack of trust in the media now, does it make sense for us to be talking about a phenomenon that started with Facebook? Or do we need to kind of, broaden the discussion to encompass those, those kinds of things that I mentioned that, maybe we didn't use the same terms to discuss them in the years after 9/11, but I think we were sort of, grasping at similar ideas then too.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about Myanmar because it was, I remember the moment where I was when it sort of brought me up short, which is, is it great to be Mark Zuckerberg or not? I don't know. I mean, it's great to have all the money, but then you've got these problems, which is like, if you make the wrong call on Myanmar, you could get lots of people killed by the government, among others. But that sort of fits a generalized framework, which doesn't apply to him, of the First Amendment, which is the speech is directly connected to the harm. If you provide that in Myanmar, you end up with mass murder. So I still think that, generally speaking, can work. Here's the problem, right? Jameel said that the business about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was disinformation. I remember the moment when I realized that the statement, if you like your insurance, you can keep it, was probably disinformation, right? Now, you may not believe that. And in fact, I don't know that it's disinformation. I just know a bunch of circumstantial things. And by the way, folks, when I learned that, I was really disappointed until I thought about, what would you do in that situation? The answer was, I would do exactly what President Obama did. But still, I have a bunch of reasons for thinking disinformation. But you see the point. I mean, whatever about Iraq, it's clearly a disaster. But these are things like this. Making these calls are going to be extremely partisan, which is, I think, part of the story with the trust in the media. That what is different is the media are much more explicitly partisan now, and partisanship is much more crazy, which is a bigger story about partisan sorting over the last 40 or 50 years.
But I do think that social media is really categorically different than prior media in at least 3 or 4 different ways, and that recognizing and acknowledging that disinformation in this context is different is important because it implies potentially different intervention points. And so you take social media, you have no gatekeepers. Anyone can create content. Anyone can distribute it, right? That's a very different landscape. You have a speed of distribution that I think is somewhat different than what we've seen with past media. You also have an ability to artificially amplify content with bots and cyborgs and to hide identity. So the authenticity of sock puppets, and it can be quite difficult to ascertain the authenticity of the actor behind it. And you have micro-targeting like we've never had before, where you're able to, Cambridge Analytica obviously made a bunch of claims that they can psychographically profile people, and I think the data is basically, it wasn't much better than a coin toss in terms of the ability to actually influence people, but it's not hard to believe that that capacity is going to improve in the future. And so in this context where you have, hidden authenticity, much faster speed of communication, no gatekeepers to that communication, artificial amplification with bots, and this micro-targeting challenge, and micro-targeting that's often dark, so you can't even see that for 2 cents a a head count, you're able to micro-target a minority or a voter in a swing district. I mean, that's a different, yes, disinformation has been around since the dawn of man, but there are, at this point, I think, different tools that at least warrant looking at the problem differently and thinking about, are there different solutions? But, and last thing I'll say, I do think that this question of impact and what impact it is actually having is a really important one, and we do have some emerging data about that, and I think that, to your point about the need for more research, making big policy decisions in a context where people really misunderstand a lot about the problem and its impact is also scary.
So it sounds like, I mean, that's a good point, that there's special factors that go into the way that we have conversations today that didn't necessarily exist before. But when we're looking at that and staying away from the huge policy decisions, we've seen, like in the past couple of years, a lot of initiatives just to curb the problem in some way. I don't think any of them have been proposed as catch-all solutions, but we've seen things like fact-checking websites. We've seen the use of AI to, say, shut down bots and accounts from other countries. We've seen, people have been proposing that the government step in and find some way to regulate the social media platforms. So just, and it's a question for all of you, what do you think is working and what isn't working? What are you most optimistic about when it comes to mis and disinformation, how we can curb its effects? Nothing's working?
I think, I think there's a real issue down the line. I think the content moderation will come to terms with that, and they have the right to. They're not limited by the First Amendment. But the real question is, there's a real asymmetric mobilization issue here over the long term, by which I mean, it really, conservatives are really sort of over the top about a lot of stuff. I agree with that. But it is really true, and you have Mark Zuckerberg's testimony to that fact. The people inside, it's asymmetric mobilization. The people making the policies inside Facebook and Google are like a university campus. So it's sort of like hate speech laws in the 1990s. We didn't go down that path then because of the courts. We may go down that path with the tech companies because the courts don't matter. But the next step beyond that is the right's just not going to say, oh, we don't. We'll start with Ted Cruz threatening you and we'll end where, right? So to me, the most important thing is, can the legitimacy of these content moderation by private companies, can it establish its legitimacy and be independent so that you don't end up with a government? The worst thing would be really continual threats, right? That's what you had with the FCC, right? So someone talks to, as Nixon's lawyers, talking to the vice president of CBS, and he says, oh yeah, we're with you. Don't think we're actually going to do anything. And there's a memo to Nixon about that. So you would end up with another situation where basically no First Amendment guarantees, and then the government's basically, probably from the right, is threatening these. And so you get the worst of private-public governance with no First Amendment protection. So independence, and a lot rides on the success of small and big tech firms. And
being able to moderate this for themselves. Do we have other thoughts on this?
Yeah, in terms of something that we're seeing work, media literacy gets trotted out as this sort of media literacy, we should do more of that. There's actually some really interesting, interesting research out of Stanford by an education professor named Sam Weinberg, who is basically looking, in the research, he compared college students, historians with PhDs, and people who are employed as fact checkers, and compared them to see how they, the ways that they verify information online. And what he found was that the fact checkers were the only ones who were able to do this 100% of the time. Even highly educated, people can be really bad at this. And he's come up with some tools that are actually that are easy. He calls them heuristics, that are sort of, when you're looking at a website online, when you're trying to figure out who's funding something, or why would somebody be writing something like this? Like, who's behind this? Really, just easy tools that students and anybody can use to kind of just get out of the website, like go onto the broader internet and verify whether something is true. And I think that that's some really exciting research because it's not hard. It doesn't take that much time, and it could make a big difference just in terms of people's everyday sort of internet activity.
Can I offer a counter
Sure.
position on that one,
Yeah.
just for fun? I mean, I think two points strike me as really important here, and when first sort of situating that, I think in the big picture there are basically three buckets of solutions or interventions on the table. They're sort of upstream work. How do we improve the quality of journalism, either identify good information or deprioritize bad information? And that's where most of civil society and Google and a few other groups' efforts have been, of how do we improve the quality of journalism, journalistic revenue models, audience engagement, right? Which I have been very skeptical of, because I think that you can have, there are many issues where we have great quality information and it's just drowned out in a sea of noise and disinformation. I would say the other plurality of efforts are focused sort of downstream on the consumption side, audience-facing efforts like fact-checking and news literacy. On the fact-checking side, the behavioral science has been very consistent that people suffer from motivated reasoning and confirmation bias, and people believe what they want to believe, and I'm skeptical that fact-checking
Not
works.
me.
Not me either. Not me. None of us, obviously. This panel excluded. And then on the media literacy front, while I'm optimistic that that might work for some segments, we can't get half of the American population to vote in a presidential election. So the idea that most people, as busy as they are going to take the time to really suss out the bad actor behind, I'm skeptical of that as well. So I think the third option is midstream, looking at the distribution, which is what's really changed in this modern environment, and looking at the platforms. And within that context, you only need to change the behaviors of 3 or 4 groups versus thousands of newsrooms or millions, hundreds of millions of citizens. So it's a more leveraged place to play. But I think, kind of to John's point, it's utterly unclear what these platforms could do to improve the situation. I would say my favorite framework for this, Nate Persley at Stanford came up with, which is, because it all starts with D's, which makes it easier, which is, okay, they could delete the content, right, which I think all of us are a little bit nervous about in a free speech context. They could demote the content, which they've already started doing. They found that basically with the fact-checking sites, when something comes up and they as false and they deprioritize it, it gets something like 80% less circulation, right? They could delay the content, which was Krishna Bharat at Google's suggestion of, let's just wait a minute once something starts to go viral, hit pause, and then check it out, right? You could disclose, I mean, this is a big thing with political ads, disclosing who's behind the content, as we discussed at dinner last night. That is a hot mess. But you could at least disclose who's behind the content. And there are a few other things you could do, digital literacy being one of them, right? But I think the question is that right now we just don't know enough about the problem to really understand how to demote content in a way that doesn't jeopardize free speech, for example. The last point I want to make, which I think is a really important one in my mind and touches, John, on your point about content moderation. And that's where I think most of the conversation tends to focus. But there are other options in the modern age. I think we always think about content as like, is this article true or not? Right? But you could also moderate at the level of the actor or the tools being employed. So you could not try and sort through, and I'm trying to imagine doing that in a foreign language. Like globally, it's very hard to scale content moderation. But you could imagine a context where you say, okay, we're going to not allow artificial amplification, and you do something around the authenticity of accounts and bots. Now, it's problematic in authoritarian regimes, but you could do that in some contexts, right? Or you could say certain actors, and you've seen some platforms do that, and that's problematic also. But I think we can all agree foreign actors in a domestic election is problematic. So there are things that you can moderate outside of content that might help.
Totally. You could also, you could do something like you could take away some of the things on Facebook, like the ability to react to things angrily, and you could take away those sort of little faces and instead offer different kinds of reactions that people can do. So could they add a link to support something? Could they add outside evidence? There are little tweaks you can make to the platforms that don't have to do with actually addressing the content, but addressing the way that people are interacting with the content, getting some of the emotion out of this. I mean, I think arguably, I think that the angry face is the most used reaction on Facebook? Like, who is that
course it is.
helping? Like, no.
There's a lot of rage that goes into social media sharing, I think. This is great. I wish this panel was much longer than this. And I would love to actually throw it out to the audience because I want to make sure that we get some questions from you guys as well. I think there's a microphone going around isn't there? There's also good old-fashioned shouting. That's okay too. Go ahead. Oh, well, there is a microphone.
Just wait for the microphone.
And there's a new law in California that says bots have to identify themselves as bots, not people. Would that help?
Bot discrimination?
I think in general it would help. Yeah. I think it can be problematic to ban bots. Bots are used for all sorts of things, including some very good things. But while there are some hard issues around the margins, I think we should be more open than we have been to requirements that bots self-identify as such. I think that would be
How
good
you
thing.
enforce that is a mystery to me.
Yeah.
And whether all the the good bots would self-identify and all the bad bots wouldn't is something I'm curious about.
One of the other aspects of all this is the whole Russian thing. I think we need to let things pass because it's tied up with a specific moment in American political history. Remember, a Russian television channel exists in the United States. It existed throughout the election, right? And presumably, if people wanted it, it would exist on every cable system. It does have to disclose itself as a foreign agent. And in fact, the whole regime has been one of disclosure, where this entire town, right up there, people listen to foreign agents, foreign speech about policy, not about elections or anything. It's about what's going to happen next week, right? So we've been open to that, but it's under a disclosure regime. It occurred to me when I was thinking about this panel, is it that people are afraid now that if you knew it was a Russian government operation, you would like it, or too many Americans would like it? Seems unlikely. They would perhaps assess it in that way. The other thing I would say about our first speaker is I'm interested in this idea of where you could, it has a downside. If you just don't want to hear people, you get rid of them, right? So you can shape your experience on Facebook. That's consistent with the Enlightenment ideal I was talking about. But it leads to the other one. Then you get into a filter bubble argument because it's personalization that led in that way.
Yeah, I think one of the real challenges here is that some of the problems we're talking about stem from decentralization and some of them stem from centralization. And so we come up with these solutions that are solutions to the decentralization problem, but they make the centralization problem worse or vice versa, right? And the idea of decentralizing to users power, this is sort of what Ethan was talking about, more power to decide what they see in their news feeds, or there's something very appealing to that. On the other hand, if you're focused principally on the filter bubble problem, it's not obvious that problem is going to be made better by that solution, right? And when Kelly talks about asking the social media companies to exercise more power over take more responsibility over what their users see. And my first reaction is that sounds great. But my second reaction is it really a solution to ask these entities that already exercise such enormous influence over public discourse to exercise even more influence over public discourse? So that's a real challenge. How do you come up with solutions that are solutions to either the decentralization or the centralization problem that don't make the other problem worse?
Solutions that don't have a terrible second consequence.
Yeah.
That's tough. Are there other?
Yeah. Hi. Sorry, I managed to jump on the mic. I just have a question. I read kind of a spooky article the other day that suggested that a lot of the public awareness about certain strategies of disinformation, by the time that they bubble up to the level of good faith public deliberation, by that time the worst actors in disinformation have already moved on to more sophisticated strategies. And I'm just sort of curious, how much of a lag is there right now in what we're talking about and what's actually happening, and how big of a problem is that?
That is a scary question.
It's totally an arms race. I mean, this is not a problem that will ever be solved, I think. And it's just the platforms change one thing, and then bad actors figure out another workaround. And I don't think this is one of the reasons that I have been skeptical about government's ability to regulate here, just because it's such a nimble playing field. But I'm also really skeptical about the platform's ability to solve it, because I don't think that their incentives, to get rid of totally fake news, I think they're incentivized to do, but to get rid of bias, like that's kind of Facebook's bread and butter, is biased news that inspires, strong emotions that people tend to engage about. I think the data is something like 20% more with content that inspires outrage. So it's hard it's such an arms race, and the technology is moving quickly enough that it's hard to imagine government solving it, and it's hard to imagine platforms solving it, and here we are.
Yeah, it is.
Job security for all of us.
The last time I was talking to people out there, it was disturbing that they didn't, weren't super confident about winning. Struck me.
Yeah, thanks.
That race.
But this is the appeal of John's argument, that it all comes down to the individual, that at the end of the day we have to invest in our own individual capacities to distinguish between stuff that's worth listening to and stuff that's not worth listening to. And I don't think that that's a complete solution, but I think that there's something very real there, and that has to be a big part of
I'm
whatever we do.
utterly skeptical if we put all of our eggs in that basket.
No, I'm not suggesting you
but I
should,
do
yeah.
think that there's a certain segment of the population that would put it upon themselves to become sufficiently news literate and savvy, and then there are a bunch that wouldn't, and that might be the part that's actually we're more concerned about.
I mean, it is a case where you have we're inundated with a lot of information, so everybody comes up with a strategy of some kind to sort through it. Maybe if you're influencing that in a positive way for at least some people. Other questions? You had one?
Sure. Hey, Alex Howard, thanks for taking questions. Whoever has the mic turns out to be a powerful thing. So I guess two things. The first is identity is a really big deal in this context. In terms of holding someone accountable for their speech, the conditions for the speech, et cetera. And we heard from Ethan about different platforms that have different approaches to that. So what do you all think about the importance of real identity and the preservation of some ability to do anonymous speaking in terms of whistleblowing, et cetera, for the future of this space? And the second is something I haven't heard very much about, is consolidation, right? Decade ago, we were talking differently about the blossoming of speech online. Now, as Ethan notes, this has been centralized. We have a duopoly, Facebook and Google, with other players sneaking in there, right? Amazon is now number 3. But the tech giants have centralized the distribution of speech. They are extraordinary gatekeepers. They're taking in the revenue. As we think about creating the next generations of speech in this country, we can't control as much what's happening elsewhere. What's the role of our government in looking at that consolidation? Particularly as a local speech that's hosted on papers has a very different context as those papers diminish, and the centralization of control over local media through things like Sinclair become an issue, particularly as they are compelled to host various kinds of misinformation or disinformation. Two different questions.
You should have been at our dinner last night.
Anytime.
I think, Jameel, you're going to take Monopoly.
Yeah, well, so maybe I'm more concerned about the centralization of power over public discourse than maybe some others in this room might be. But it seems to me that for a variety of reasons, anti-monopoly solutions are especially worth considering. And anti-monopoly, broader than antitrust, not just not just breaking up the companies in in the way we normally mean that phrase, but also there are other softer anti-monopoly solutions like data portability solutions, like things that counter the network effect, right? And I'd be a lot less worried about these platforms' content moderation policies, for example, if there were a dozen of these platforms rather than 2 of them, and even if you think about this stuff as a First Amendment lawyer, then there's an additional reason to focus on anti-monopoly solutions is that the First Amendment is less likely to be an obstacle to those solutions than it is to regulation that required Facebook, say, to carry everybody's speech, right? Facebook would have a very plausible and I think persuasive First Amendment argument that that kind of regulation would be unconstitutional. And so for that reason, too, I think gravitating towards anti-monopoly solutions, again, in this broader sense, not just antitrust, but anti-monopoly solutions is worth thinking about.
So, yes, the important thing here, and it comes up in the bias argument, is that there be next alternatives, right? Do you have a next alternative if you get thrown off Facebook? And if Gab's kind of a mess, but it's still an alternative. The other thing I would say is, at this stage of the game, people tend to sort of say it's a monopoly and it's a monopoly forever, and they've said that about lots of businesses over the course of my life. This is the network effects argument, which is the real argument here, is about the economics of multi-sided platforms, right? And if you're sure that the economics of two-sided, multi-sided platforms can't go the other way, and Mark Zuckerberg doesn't seem too sure, he seems somewhat sure that it can go the other way, right? And it seemed like it was sort of rocking about March of this last year. Then you will be confident that something has to happen. I'm not confident that economics, that multi-sided network effects can't go the other way. And even if you believe that, I would say, look at the history of the FCC, which was supposed to, right, deal with these competitive effects, anti-competitive effects. Tom Hazlitt's book, The Political Spectrum, documents ad nauseum that what was done, the vast wasteland guy was a guy that prevented you from getting cable about 20 years, 25 years early. So I don't even think that, it depends on the solution. But you can't be confident that you will get an anti-monopoly solution.
I also think there's a really quick but very important point here, which is it depends on what problem you're trying to solve. And you touched on this earlier, which is there's two potential problems. If you're using antitrust to try and address, it's like a big tool, and then you've got disinformation, right? And how is it going to affect that? And it depends on what the problem is. So if you are concerned about the moderate middle and that you have all these extremists that are like polluting my mother, right, with their extremist ideas and pulling her out to the fringes, right, then maybe you want to break up the companies, right? And then you have all the extremists off in their own sort of echo chambers, not polluting the moderate middle, but sort of further firing each other up, right? But if your concern is we don't want to further fire up the extremists, then you have the 4chan, 8chan as a perfect experiment of when 4chan said no more white supremacy on our platform, but it just moved to 8. It just went to another platform, right? So I think...
Yeah, I think it matters. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but it matters how you break them up, right? I mean, you could break up Facebook by taking WhatsApp and moving it away, and that might not have any effect at all on disinformation. On the other hand, you could take the social network, the social graph, and break that off Facebook. That might have an effect on, right? I don't mean to endorse any of these ideas. I'm just saying that there are different ways of doing it, and different ways of doing it might have different implications for disinformation.
So we
More
are
research.
just about out of time, but I think that we could probably do this for another hour or so if you gave us the chance. But no, this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I think we solved it. I think we're done with disinformation. So you saw it right now. Thank you so much, and thank our wonderful panelists for being here. And